The first rays of spring sunlight stretched across the rolling hills of Ashcombe as a black carriage climbed the long gravel drive toward the grand estate. Towering stone walls, trimmed hedges, and ancient oak trees surrounded the manor like silent guardians, giving visitors the unmistakable feeling that every inch of the property had been ruled by discipline for generations. Inside the mansion, clocks chimed with perfect precision. Every servant moved according to an invisible rhythm. Silver gleamed without fingerprints. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers. Nothing was left to chance. And at the center of that order stood the Duke of Ashcombe. Arthur Ashcombe had inherited not only one of England's oldest estates but also a reputation that frightened even experienced servants. His standards were impossible, his words few, and his expectations absolute. During breakfast, no spoon was ever misplaced. During dinner, no servant dared make unnecessary noise. Mistakes were remembered far longer than successes. It was precisely why another housemaid had resigned the previous evening without notice. The Duke folded his morning newspaper before looking toward his butler. "Has the replacement arrived?" "She should be here within the hour, Your Grace," replied Mr. Whitmore, the elderly butler who had served the Ashcombe family for nearly 40 years. The Duke sighed. "Another hopeful girl from the countryside? So I believe. They never understand what this house requires." Whitmore remained silent. Experience had taught him that arguing with the Duke accomplished little. Outside, the carriage finally stopped. A young woman stepped onto the gravel road carrying a single worn leather suitcase. Her plain gray dress had been carefully mended several times. Her gloves were faded. A straw hat shaded gentle brown eyes that wandered across the enormous estate with equal parts wonder and nervousness. Her name was Clara Bennet. She came from a small farming village where life revolved around hard work rather than etiquette. After losing both parents within 2 years, she had supported her younger brother by taking whatever work she could find. When he left to apprentice as a blacksmith, Clara decided to seek steadier employment in one of England's great houses. She knew almost nothing about noble families. She only knew she needed the opportunity. Whitmore greeted her warmly. "Miss Bennet?" "Yes, sir. I am Whitmore, the Duke's butler. Welcome to Ashcombe Manor." She smiled with relief. "Thank you, sir." As they entered the magnificent entrance hall, Clara stopped for a brief moment. The ceiling stretched nearly 3 stories high. Portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilded frames. Crystal light danced across polished marble. She had never imagined such wealth could exist beneath one roof. Whitmore noticed. "Overwhelming." "A little," Clara admitted softly. "There is no shame in that." Unfortunately, not everyone shared the butler's kindness. Several servants exchanged amused glances as Clara passed. "She looks terrified. She'll be gone before summer." "They always are." Clara pretended not to hear. Whitmore led her through endless hallways while explaining the daily routine. Breakfast preparations began before sunrise. Bedrooms were inspected twice daily. Hallways polished every afternoon. Laundry sorted by family rank. Silver counted every evening. Each responsibility sounded more demanding than the last. Then they entered the servants' dining room where Mrs. Harcourt, the formidable housekeeper, waited with folded arms. She examined Clara from head to toe. "So this is our new maid?" "Yes," Whitmore answered. Mrs. Harcourt circled Clara slowly. "Your posture needs improvement." "Yes, ma'am." "Your shoes are unsuitable." "I'll do better." "You've never served nobility before?" "No, ma'am." Mrs. Harcourt gave a thin smile. "I suspected as much." Without another word, she handed Clara a long list of duties. "Your room is upstairs. You begin immediately." The first week proved harder than Clara had imagined. She polished the wrong banister, folded napkins incorrectly, forgot which drawing room belonged to which wing. Once she nearly entered the Duke's private library without permission. Each mistake earned another sharp lecture. Other servants whispered whenever she passed. "The village girl won't survive. Poor thing. She's hopeless." Every evening Clara returned to her tiny attic room exhausted. More than once she considered leaving. But each time she unfolded the small family photograph she carried inside her Bible. Her parents had worked through hardship without complaint. So would she. Instead of becoming discouraged, Clara began observing. She watched how the experienced footmen organized deliveries. She learned from the elderly cook which suppliers arrived late. She memorized every hallway, staircase, and storage room. She noticed something many overlooked. Although the estate appeared perfect, many departments barely communicated with one another. Kitchen staff blamed housekeeping. Housekeeping blamed the gardeners. The gardeners blamed stable workers. Everyone worked hard, yet everyone worked separately. Small misunderstandings wasted hours each day. Clara quietly began helping wherever she could. If the laundry was behind schedule, she stayed late. If the kitchen lacked extra hands before dinner, she volunteered. If an older servant struggled with heavy baskets, she carried them herself. She never asked for praise. She simply worked. Her kindness slowly caught attention. The elderly seamstress smiled whenever Clara visited. "You remind me of my daughter." The head gardener began saving flowers for her tiny room. Even a few younger maids started asking her advice. Mrs. Harcourt noticed, and she disliked it. One afternoon, preparations for an important luncheon nearly collapsed. Fresh linens had been delivered to the wrong dining hall. Kitchen staff expected guests in one room while footmen prepared another. Panic spread through the servants' corridors. Mrs. Harcourt shouted orders. No one seemed certain who was responsible. Without interrupting anyone, Clara hurried through the manor, directing footmen to move tables, asking maids to replace linens, and informing the kitchen of the correct schedule. Within 20 minutes the confusion disappeared. By the time the Duke welcomed his distinguished guests, every place setting stood exactly where it belonged. The luncheon unfolded flawlessly. Later that afternoon, the Duke glanced toward Whitmore. "I was informed there was some confusion before lunch." "There was, Your Grace. And yet everything proceeded perfectly." "Yes, sir." The Duke returned to his paperwork. "Good." He never asked how the problem had been solved. Across the corridor, Clara quietly resumed polishing silver as though nothing unusual had happened. Whitmore watched her for several moments. Then his eyes drifted toward the Duke's study. Months of service had taught him to recognize something unusual. The young woman everyone had dismissed after a single glance possessed a rare gift, not merely for working hard, but for bringing calm wherever disorder appeared. As evening settled over Ashcombe Manor, Clara stood outside beneath the fading sky, looking across the gardens glowing in the last light of day. She remembered the whispers. She won't last. She smiled gently to herself. "I didn't come here to prove them wrong," she whispered. "I came to prove that honest work and kindness are worth more than anyone's first impression." Far above, in his study window, the Duke remained convinced she was only another temporary servant. Neither of them knew that before summer arrived, the quiet village girl would begin changing not only the household, but the people within it. Summer arrived at Ashcombe Manor with endless days of golden sunshine, blooming gardens, and an endless stream of distinguished guests. Every year, the Duke hosted diplomats, neighboring landowners, military officers, and members of high society. For the servants, it was the busiest, and most exhausting, season of the year. This summer, however, trouble arrived before the first guests did. Within 2 weeks, 3 experienced servants left the estate. One retired because of poor health, another accepted work in London for higher wages, and a third returned home to care for an ill parent. Their departures left enormous gaps in the household staff. Mrs. Harcourt did her best to keep order, but the pressure was beginning to show. Maids forgot assignments, footmen misunderstood schedules, and meals were served later than usual. Tempers flared in every corridor. The Duke noticed only one thing. "The house feels slower," he remarked during breakfast. Whitmore answered carefully. "We are rather short-handed, Your Grace." "Then hire replacements." "We have tried." The Duke frowned. Competent servants are becoming difficult to find. For the first time in years, Ashcombe Manor was struggling to maintain the flawless reputation it had always enjoyed. Clara watched everything quietly. She saw exhausted maids carrying twice their normal workload. She noticed cooks waiting for ingredients that had never been delivered. Gardeners arrived with flowers after the dining room had already been decorated. No one lacked dedication. They lacked coordination. One evening, after most of the servants had gone to bed, Clara remained in the servants' hall with sheets of paper spread across a long wooden table. She carefully listed every daily task performed throughout the estate. When Whitmore entered, he looked at the pages with curiosity. "What are you doing, Miss Bennet?" "I'm trying to understand where the delays begin." The butler adjusted his spectacles. "You've been awake for hours." "I know. And why would you spend your own time solving someone else's problem?" Clara smiled. "Because when one person struggles in this house, eventually everyone does." Whitmore nodded slowly. It was a simple answer, but one few people ever considered. The following morning, Clara approached Mrs. Harcourt with hesitation. "If I may suggest something?" The housekeeper looked up impatiently. "What is it?" I've written a schedule that lets the kitchen, laundry, and housekeeping know exactly when each department finishes its work. It might save everyone some time. Mrs. Harcourt barely glanced at the papers. I've managed this household for 20 years. Of course, ma'am. I don't need advice from a village maid. Clara quietly folded the pages. Yes, ma'am. She walked away without another word. Whitmore had witnessed the entire exchange. Later that afternoon he asked Clara if he could see the schedules. He studied them carefully. Every task flowed naturally into the next. Deliveries matched meal preparation. Laundry collection no longer interrupted room cleaning. Garden flowers would arrive exactly when decorators needed them. It was remarkably practical. Without announcing the change, Whitmore discreetly introduced parts of Clara's system to several department heads. The effects appeared almost immediately. Within days, breakfast service finished earlier. Guest rooms were prepared before visitors arrived. Kitchen staff stopped waiting for supplies. Servants no longer rushed from one emergency to another. The estate began moving with a rhythm it had not known for years. The younger servants soon realized something else about Clara. Whenever someone made a mistake, she never humiliated them. Instead of saying, "You did this wrong," she would quietly ask, "Would it help if I showed you another way?" She remembered birthdays. She thanked people for small acts of kindness. She stayed behind to help without expecting anyone to notice. Gradually, the atmosphere throughout Ashcombe Manor changed. Laughter returned to the servants' hall. People volunteered to assist one another. Arguments became less frequent. Even Mrs. Harcourt could not deny that morale had improved. One afternoon, the Duke hosted several influential guests from London. After touring the estate, one gentleman remarked with admiration, "I've rarely seen such a smoothly managed household." Another added, "Your servants seem unusually content." The Duke accepted the compliments with polite gratitude, assuming years of strict discipline deserved the credit. That evening, however, curiosity led him to ask Whitmore, "What has changed recently?" "In what sense, Your Grace?" "The household runs differently." Whitmore answered honestly. "Miss Bennet has had rather more influence than you may realize." "The young maid?" "Yes, sir." The Duke looked genuinely surprised. "I've scarcely spoken to her." "No, sir." "And yet you believe she's responsible?" Whitmore smiled faintly. "I believe she helps others become their best." The Duke said nothing more, but for the first time, Clara Bennet occupied his thoughts. A few days later, he observed her from the library window. She was speaking with two frightened young maids who had accidentally broken a porcelain vase. Instead of scolding them, Clara calmly divided the cleanup into simple tasks, reassuring them that panic would only make matters worse. Within minutes, the hallway looked as though nothing had happened. The Duke found himself watching longer than intended. There was something unusual about her. She possessed authority without demanding it. People followed her because they trusted her, not because they feared her. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed Clara's growing reputation. Mrs. Harcourt had spent decades as the unquestioned leader of the household staff. Now she noticed servants seeking Clara's advice before approaching her. Jealousy quietly took root. The opportunity to strike came sooner than expected. One morning, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe's antique sapphire brooch disappeared from its velvet case. The jewel had belonged to the Duke's late mother and carried enormous sentimental value. The entire household was immediately searched. Whispers spread rapidly. Only 3 servants had entered Lady Beatrice's chambers that morning. One of them was Clara. Mrs. Harcourt wasted no time. "I'm afraid the evidence speaks for itself," she said coldly. Several servants looked at Clara with disbelief. Others refused to believe she could steal anything. Whitmore remained silent. The Duke himself questioned Clara. She stood calmly before him. "Did you take the brooch?" "No, Your Grace." "Can you explain why you were in the room?" "I was changing the flowers." "You understand how serious this is?" "I do." The room fell silent. Instead of pleading or becoming angry, Clara asked one question. "May I examine the room once more?" The Duke raised an eyebrow. "You believe you'll find something?" "I believe the truth usually leaves small traces." Permission was granted. Clara slowly walked through the bedroom, observing details others had ignored. The window had been left slightly open. Fresh mud appeared beneath the balcony doors despite clear weather. A broken feather rested beneath the dressing table. She stepped onto the balcony and looked toward the gardens. Below stood an old oak tree with a magpie's nest nestled among its branches. Clara smiled. She had seen the same bird stealing shiny objects several times during the spring. A gardener climbed the tree. Moments later, he returned holding Lady Beatrice's sapphire brooch. Relief swept through the household. The accusations vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The Duke looked directly at Clara. "I owe you an apology." She lowered her eyes respectfully. "There is no need, Your Grace." "There is every need." For the first time since she arrived at Ashcombe Manor, the Duke spoke to her not as an insignificant servant, but as someone whose honesty and intelligence deserved respect. As the warm days of summer continued, an unspoken truth settled over the estate. Whenever problems arose, people no longer looked first to the housekeeper. They looked to Clara Bennet. Without ever asking for authority, she had earned it. By the middle of summer, Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like the rigid, silent estate it had been only a few months earlier. The polished floors still gleamed, the silver still shone, and every room remained immaculate, but something far more valuable had changed. The people had changed. Servants greeted one another with genuine smiles instead of nervous glances. New employees were welcomed with patience rather than suspicion. Meals reached the dining room on time, guest chambers were prepared without confusion, and even the busiest days passed with remarkable calm. Visitors began to notice. During a weekend gathering, the Duchess of Waverley remarked while strolling through the gardens with the Duke, "Your household has an entirely different spirit this year." The Duke looked toward the manor where servants moved with quiet confidence. "I've heard similar comments. It feels happier." He offered a polite smile, but her words stayed with him. For years he had believed that fear created discipline and discipline created excellence. Yet now, the finest order his estate had ever known had grown from something entirely different: respect. That evening he called Whitmore into his study. "You once told me Miss Bennet had influenced this household." "I did, Your Grace." "I believe you understated the matter." Whitmore smiled. "I thought it best that you discover it yourself." The Duke leaned back in his chair. "When she arrived, I said she wouldn't last a month." "I remember. I've rarely been so mistaken." Meanwhile, Clara continued her work exactly as before. Despite the admiration she had earned, she never acted as though she held any special importance. She still helped carry laundry baskets when needed. She still served tea when the staff fell behind. She still listened patiently whenever a young maid needed encouragement. That humility inspired even greater loyalty. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the prestigious Hawthorne estate, one of the wealthiest households in England. Whitmore personally delivered it to Clara. She opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a formal offer. The owners of Hawthorne Estate had heard remarkable stories about the young woman who had transformed Ashcombe Manor. They offered her the position of head housekeeper, a role carrying triple her current wages, private quarters, and a level of respect few women of her background could ever hope to achieve. For a long moment, Clara simply stared at the letter. It was everything she had once dreamed of. News of the offer spread quietly through the servants' hall. No one celebrated. Instead, an unusual silence settled over the household. The young maids worried aloud. What will happen if she leaves? The gardeners exchanged concerned looks. Even the cooks, who rarely left the kitchens, spoke of little else. Mrs. Harcourt, who had once viewed Clara as a rival, surprised everyone by walking into Clara's room that evening. She stood awkwardly near the doorway. "I haven't always treated you fairly." Clara looked up gently. "You don't need to say anything." "Yes, I do." Mrs. Harcourt took a slow breath. "I believed authority came from protecting my position." She lowered her eyes. "You showed me it comes from helping others." It was the closest thing to an apology anyone had ever heard from the stern housekeeper. Clara accepted it with a warm smile. The following morning, the Duke requested that Clara join him in the library. She entered quietly. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" He gestured toward a chair. "I've heard about Hawthorne Estate." "Yes, sir." "It is an excellent opportunity." "It is." "And have you made your decision?" Clara hesitated. "Not yet." The Duke folded his hands. "There was a time when I believed this house succeeded because of rules." He looked around the vast library filled with generations of Ashcombe history. "I now understand I was wrong." Clara remained silent. "I built order through expectation." He smiled faintly. "You built it through trust." Those simple words carried more weight than any compliment she had ever received. The Duke continued. "When you arrived, I judged you before learning your name. I remember. I believed birth determined ability." He shook his head. "You have taught me otherwise." For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, the Duke stood and walked toward the window overlooking the estate. "I will not ask you to remain." Clara looked surprised. If Hawthorne offers the future you deserve, you should accept it. She thanked him quietly and left the room with much to consider. That evening, Clara wandered through the gardens where she had often found peace after difficult days. She remembered arriving with a single suitcase. She remembered the whispers that she would never survive. She remembered every mistake, every lesson, every person who had slowly become part of her life. Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like a place of employment. It felt like home. The next morning, every servant gathered in the great entrance hall. Word had spread that Clara would announce her decision. The atmosphere was filled with anxious anticipation. Clara stepped forward holding the unopened acceptance papers from Hawthorne Estate. She smiled at the faces around her. "When I came here, I was searching for work." Her voice remained calm. "I found something much greater." Several servants wiped away quiet tears. "I found people who became my family." Then, before everyone's eyes, she folded the Hawthorne offer and gently placed it into the fireplace. The letter disappeared into golden flames. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. "I've decided to stay." The servants erupted into joyful applause. Some laughed. Others openly cried. Even Mrs. Harcourt smiled without embarrassment. The Duke stepped forward. "In that case," he announced, his voice carrying through the grand hall, "it is time this house recognized what has long been true." He turned toward Clara. "Effective immediately, Miss Clara Bennet will oversee the management of Ashcombe Manor." The applause grew even louder. No one questioned the decision. Everyone already looked to her for guidance. The announcement simply gave a title to the leadership she had quietly earned. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the Duke and Whitmore stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens. Servants laughed softly while finishing the day's work. Flowers swayed in the warm summer breeze. The estate felt more alive than either man could remember. The Duke smiled thoughtfully. "Do you remember what I said when she first arrived?" Whitmore nodded. "She won't last a month here." The Duke chuckled at himself. "I've spent my entire life believing that titles built great houses." He watched Clara walking through the gardens, stopping to help a young maid carry a basket of fresh flowers despite her new position. "No," he said quietly. "People do." Whitmore smiled. "And good people inspire greatness in others." The Duke nodded. "I thought I was giving a frightened young woman a chance." He paused, watching the estate she had transformed. In truth, she gave this house its future. As the last light of summer settled over Ashcombe Manor, the grand estate stood as proof that true leadership is never demanded. It is earned through humility, compassion, and unwavering service. And the young woman whom everyone expected to fail had become the heart of the house, leaving behind a legacy far greater than wealth or title. Sometimes, the strongest foundation of a great home is not built by the one who owns it, but by the one who believes in every person living within it.